Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Today, I want to talk about the term Antira. Antira is a cousin to Antifa. Um, so, what is Antira? Any guesses? Um, Anti-racism. And Antira is not as well known as Antifa. Um, I suppose that's because anti-Ra is a relatively new term, a relatively new acronym. Antifa is much older. Both of them originated in German and then were transplanted into English. But anti-Ra, I think especially in the US, is extremely important. We have a long history in the United States of racism. Arguably, racism itself started in the US, at least in its modern form. Um, Racism in its modern form basically began on the southern plantation, where you had three basic categories of people. You had the blue bloods, represented by the master and the mistress, the owner and the owners of the plantation. Then you had the rednecks, who were the white farm workers. And then you had the blacks, who, of course, were not called blacks back at that time, but I will not and never have used the word for black people. Let's just use black or African American. Um, the term anti-rad, therefore, is a term designed to complete, to absent the absence of racism in critical realist terms. Again, going back to Roy Bhaskaar's definition or development or formulation of a dialectic, he says it begins with an absence. In this case, that absence is racism. Then it is contradicted by absenting the absence, in this case, anti-rat or anti-racism. And finally, the result is transformation. A transformed society which is free from all elements of racism. Because ultimately, why eliminate racism unless you are working toward the greater goal of establishing a communist society? Um, Now, will that communist society be established initially in the US? I don't think so. I think it will be established initially in the third world. But still, even in the first world, especially in my own country, the US, we need to deal with the horrendous problem of racism. I remember back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when I was in the New Left, one of our primary objectives was the civil rights movement. We were working for a racism-free society. That was basically what we would say. We wanted a society totally free of the stench of racism. Did we achieve that? No, not entirely. Did we make progress in that direction? Some, but certainly not enough. The fact that 2 generations later, the Black Lives Matter movement was started indicates that we certainly did not make enough progress. We have a long way to go until we reach that point. And I hope we do reach that point relatively soon, because I don't think that the first world will be around, at least not in its present form, much longer. I could be wrong, but that's my view. I think that the first world is simply running out of steam. The dialectic is a part of nature, and the contradictions in capitalism, including the major contradiction of imperialism, are slowly but surely whittling away at the capitalist world system. Yet, racism is another contradiction in the capitalist world system. And especially in the US, one sees the horrendous forms into which racism has developed. How African Americans have been systematically targeted by the police with virtually no historical consequences, arguably until recently. But even now, the consequences for police officers who kill African Americans are relatively few, meaning most African Americans who are killed by police officers do not get justice. The police officers are not convicted. That is a horrendous situation, and it is one that we need to think about, to reflect upon, and to consider how we might improve. I have seen it firsthand. I told you before about the story of Jack and Hattie. How Jack, who dared to refuse to give up his seat to a sheriff's deputy in the front bleachers of a high school basketball game, was shot in the head by a sheriff's deputy. How that police officer was arrested. No charges were filed by the district attorney, and that deputy was released the following day, and he was back on the force. There is no excuse for that kind of thing in American society, and yet we seem to tolerate it. Just like we seem to tolerate the increasing authoritarianism or fascism, which is gradually, maybe not so gradually, maybe rapidly in some cases, eating away at the fabric of American society, and not only of American society, of other societies as well. Now, is racism a universal phenomenon? No, it's not universal at all. I remember when I was in Congo, I was called a European, and I corrected the person and said, no, I'm not from Europe. I'm from the US. I was born and raised in New York City. And the person said, well, that means you're a European. I said, okay, what am I going to say? All right, I'm a European. So when I was there, I was a European. Why? Because what mattered in sub-Saharan Africa was not race. In fact, they really had no concept of race, although certainly the more educated people in Zaire or the Congo were aware of it, were aware of racism and race in other parts of the world. To them, everything was tribe. And since I did not belong to a tribe, I was a European. That's simply the way that it was classified in Africa. Similarly, in India, and unfortunately, I have never had the pleasure of visiting that country. Hopefully, I will at some point. I've always had a desire, personally, to visit the Punjab, both in India and in Pakistan. Whether that is possible, I don't know, but I would still like to visit the Punjab, at least in India, but preferably in both India and Pakistan. In India, there is no concept of race either. The concept in India is entirely different. It is of caste. And caste is a translation of the Sanskrit word varna. Varna refers to occupations, an occupation. A varna is an occupation. Now, over the centuries, the concept of varna became much more rigid. And so, if your father was a member of a certain varna or occupation, and you were the son, then you would go into that same varna or occupation. That's kind of like the way most pre-modern societies worked anyway. You were pretty much compelled by circumstance to go into the occupation of your father, or in some cases, both of your parents. And usually that occupation was in some way related to farming. But the Sanskrit or Indian varnas were much more diverse. Then below the varnas, there was a category, and there still is a category, which roughly translates as casteless people. Sometimes that word is translated as untouchable. That is actually not an entirely accurate translation of the word. A better translation is casteless. They are people who literally have no caste. And so, historically, in India, if you are a casteless person, you work in the most menial jobs imaginable, like a street sweeper or a janitor or something like that. If you are in the highest caste, the Brahmins, that's the priestly caste. And so traditionally, literally, the Brahmins were the priests in Hinduism or Vedanta. And so the caste system was very strict. There were basically no exceptions to it. You had no choice. You couldn't pick your occupation as people do now. Your occupation was chosen for you based on birth. Now, again, certainly India was not the only society to do that. But in India, the system of varnas were based into, or I should say, baked into, the actual religion of Hinduism. So it was an actual religious practice. The varnas were a religious system. If you chose not to follow the varnas, then in principle, you were going against Hinduism. When Sikhism started by Guru Nanak, in Sikhism, Guru Nanak eliminated the Varna system, the rigid caste system. For that reason, among others, Sikhs were for a long time persecuted in India. They refused to follow the line that was established by the Varna system. So that is a bit of an aside. In any event, my point is that race is certainly not universal. but it is universal enough, and that is mostly due to the imperialism and to the cultural hegemony of the United States, to the spread of American culture throughout the world. That has resulted in the incorporation of races into societies which never had slavery, which in a way makes no sense because slavery produced races. And originally, there was only one race. That was black people. White people were not a race. There was not even a term for white people. Some anthropologists use the term Caucasoid or Caucasian, but in common everyday speech, nobody else did. If you were not Caucasian or a Caucasoid or white, then you were black. That was it. That's the simple categorization system of race that existed in the United States. And consequently, if you were black, under the old Jim Crow laws, now we seem to be seeing a revival of Jim Crow laws, and mostly in the same states which were a part of the Confederacy. Not entirely, but mostly. So the concept of race, which again, in a modern sense, began in the United States, has spread throughout the world. Now, does that mean that the word race is modern? No. At one time, the word race simply meant people. So, for example, you might talk about the German race, the English race, the French race, something like that. It simply meant people. That was it. For some reason, over time, again, the word race began to develop its modern usage. So race now refers to a classification system, or I should say classification systems for categorizing people based supposedly on racial characteristics. Now, is that true? No, it's not true. Here's why. As I used to tell my students, there is a difference between race and racial characteristics. Racial characteristics are things like hair color, eye color, skin color, the shape of the eyes, I should say the eye fold, the shape of the nose, common blood types, which is why you have a predominance of sickle cell anemia in many African American people, a predominance of Tay-Sachs disease in primarily Jewish people. All of those are racial characteristics. But when we are categorizing race in the United States anyway, we generally do not include the vast majority of racial characteristics. Primarily, we include skin color and the eye fold, right? To a lesser extent, the texture of the hair, but primarily skin color and the eye fold. Those are the major criteria for categorizing race. Now, do we do that consistently? Once again, no. Think about it. former president, Barack Obama. His father was from Kenya. His mother is what would ordinarily be called a white person from Kansas, a Caucasoid or Caucasian from Kansas. Barack Obama defined himself as an African American. That is not the way the term African American or black person was originally used. But that's certainly his prerogative. He can call himself whatever he wants. That's his privilege. But a further problem with that, Barack Obama could have just as easily called himself a white person because his mother was white. So why is it that people who are biracial, one parent black, one parent white, will commonly define themselves as black? The answer is bigotry. It goes back to slave times and the period right after slave times. In Louisiana, for example, if you had 1/16 black ancestry, you were legally black. In Virginia, if you had 1/32 black ancestry, you were legally black. Does that make any scientific sense? Of course not. But it's purely bigotry. Now, many people have tried to reinterpret that as a kind of pride, and that's fine. People can interpret things however they like. It is not for me to tell people how they should define themselves or to tell people that they should not define themselves in a certain way. But what I will point out again is that the reason why the racial system exists the way it does in the United States is because of the slave system. The reason why biracial people, black, white, call themselves black generally is because of the slave system. That is what created the concept of race to begin with. So, is race logical? No, it's not logical at all. It literally makes no sense. And yet, to use the old expression, it has become as American as apple pie. We simply take it for granted. I remember I used to sometimes ask my students, why is Barack Obama black? The most common answer I would get is because he looks black. What does that mean? It means nothing. It means that that person is looking for the racial characteristics which define that person as being of sub-Saharan African ancestry and ignoring the characteristics that would define that person as being of European ancestry. Why do we not define race based on hair color? I mean, if we did that, for instance, many Irish people, we could say that the Irish, who often have red hair, would be of a different race than people with brown hair or black hair or black hair. Why not define race based upon eye color or whatever? In other words, there is no reason why we categorize race the way that we do. It is an invention of the third world designed to, quote unquote, keep people in their place. That's precisely why it was designed. It was designed to ensure white power and white privilege, and to prevent people that white people did not want to have that power and privilege from getting it. So, for example, when Italians and Jews came into the United States around the turn of the 20th century, as my grandparents and great-grandparents did, they were not defined as being white. They were defined as being Jewish. That was a separate category from black and white. Same thing was true with Italians. Same thing was true with Irish. What happened? What happened was World War II. All of a sudden, you had people who had been commonly seen as belonging to different categories of people, all fighting side by side in World War II. And the people who were white were Anglos, Anglo-Americans, English Americans. That's basically what white was. People who were of English ancestry, not Irish, not British, but English ancestry specifically. And they began to realize, hey, these people, they almost look like us, meaning Jews, Irish, Italians, look pretty close. They have been assimilated. I doubt they thought of that word, but I'm sure they observed it, meaning they had taken on the behavior or customs that we have historically had. And so it just became common to think of these people all of a sudden as being white. When my father was a kid, he was not seen as being white. He told me some really, really horrendous stories of what happened to him in World War II. He said that this one person from someplace, I believe it was Boston, but I might be mistaken on that. That doesn't really matter. Walked up to him and, in all seriousness, not trying to insult my father, although of course it was insulting him, but that was not the objective, asked my father if he could see my father's horns. He literally believed that my father had horns. That's what he was taught. That goes back to the concept of Jews as Christ killers. I have been called a Christ killer once, but only once. For the most part, since I lived most of my childhood in New York City, not all of it, but most of it, I was spared that kind of treatment. But for the end of my childhood, I was not. And I saw what anti-Semitism looks like in the US. And although I am an anti-Zionist, a very strong anti-Zionist, I am also opposed to anti-Semitism. Be no doubt about that. I despise anti-Semitism just as I despise Zionism. So those two categories are not related at all, despite the efforts of AIPAC and some other organizations to collapse them into one, and also the Israeli government to collapse them into one. When my father returned from fighting in World War II, and he almost died at one point, but he survived. He almost broke his back, but he was okay, basically. He couldn't go into the occupation he wanted to go into, but nonetheless, physically, he was basically okay. Um, he was all of a sudden white. I can't even imagine that. Going from being not white to being white. The closest I have come to doing that is intentionally. As I have said in this podcast before, although I recognize that I benefit from white privilege, I would never deny that. That would be vulgar. I need to acknowledge it and to work against it. So I'm not denying that I benefit from white privilege. But one of the ways in which I reject white privilege is by defining myself as a brown person. After all, if Arabs, who are my cousins, are defined as brown people, then why are not I brown as well? There is no logical answer to that. The only answer is that race itself makes no sense. In other words, as we say in sociology, race is a social construction. It's an example of the social construction of reality, as sociologist Peter Berger and also his partner Thomas Luckman described it. There is no such thing as race. It doesn't exist. There are racial characteristics like skin color, eye color, hair color, whatever, but there is no such thing as race. And I hope that the time will come. I do not anticipate that it will come soon. I also feel that this is one of the major reasons, in addition to imperialism, why the first world is in such lousy shape. But I hope that when the third world has power and the first world does not, that the third world will completely and thoroughly demolish the concept of race. I'm not holding my breath. I do not expect to see it happen in my lifetime. I could be surprised, but I don't expect it. I hope for it, but it would really, really surprise me if all of a sudden race were eliminated. I mean, how would that even happen? I can't conceive of it. Maybe, but it makes no sense to me. Race is one of the ways of defining people as being of a higher social class. That is how we look at race in sociology. Race is a class marker. It's a class indicator. So if you look at a person's race, and based upon that race, based upon how a person looks, you can say, ah, this person belongs to this particular social class. That's basically what race does. Now, race is gradually losing its power to do that as more and more African Americans rise up in social class and social stature. And new categories of people, such as Latino and Latina Americans, are replacing African Americans as occupying that kind of lower status. And that is also sad. But either way, race is a class marker, or to put it even more precisely, race is a marker of capitalism. Race is used by the capitalist system to put people in a certain category and to keep those same people out of another category, to put people in a certain occupation and to keep them out of another occupation, to force people through segregation to live in a certain neighborhood, to go to a particular school, and not to live in another neighborhood and go to another school. So that's basically what race does. From a Marxist standpoint, race is a class marker. And it has been so predominant in the first world, especially in my own country, the United States, that it's again difficult for me to imagine the United States without it. But someday, I hope, in the future, we will do away with race and all of the horrendous problems of discrimination, oppression, and segregation that it has brought along with it. For the time being, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.